worst storm ever to hit the Great Lakes occurred in November 1913. It was early November. Blizzards paralyzed traffic in Port Huron as well as other cities in other Great Lakes states. Streetcars were stranded by heavy drifts. Train schedules had to be canceled. Areas around Lake Huron were under 4 foot of snow. Telephone and telegraph lines were down across Michigan and Ontario. Yet it was much worse on the lakes. Coast Guard stations hoisted weather flag warnings of hurricane-force winds on Friday, November 7th. This is what the Point of Arcs Coast Guard station looked like on November 7th. This is what it looked like on November 9th. Port Huron Life-Saving Station fared better. At the time, they were about 6 miles north of where the Blue Water Bridge would eventually be built. But they also had problems. Their boats, their life-saving boats, were wrecked. And so they called Tom Reed, and let's pick up the story there. Tom was keeping vigil at the tug office when the Coast Guard called. Their boats had been smashed and wrecked at the station just north along the lake, and it seemed there was a big freighter in distress just opposite. When dawn, Tom was nosing out into the wildly churning lake aboard the tug Sarnia City, trying to negotiate the short distance from the mouth of the river. He passed the lightship on Corsica Shoal, which had been torn from its mooring and was lying at anchor. Some distance ahead he saw the 600-foot freighter, Matthew Andrews, worth $250,000, struggling to make the river. He was watching through the glasses when she struck the bar that had caught and held the floundering lightship. He had never before actually seen a ship strike. On Saturday, November 8th, the ore boat Charles S. Price shoved off at Ashtabula, Ohio, into Lake Erie with a load of coal and without his first assistant engineer, Milton Smith. Chief engineer tried to talk him into making the voyage, arguing, "Get that wild hair out of your nose and stick aboard. Why throw money in the bilge? The price will be tied up for the winter inside of 3 weeks, and you'll collect crew bonus on top of regular pay. Take my advice, son. Think it over." Mr. Smith did think it over, and decided to return to Port Huron on the train to his wife and children. After midnight on Sunday morning, as the Price steamed up the St. Clair River and past Smith's house into Lake Huron, a gale was blowing in from the northeast. It was unlike any gale they had ever seen. The reason we know this is because every survivor on the Great Lakes for that time period said it wasn't like anything they ever saw. The snow was so thick they couldn't see their smokestack. The waves were so high that they went right over the pilot house. It wasn't unusual for the waves to go over the cargo holds, but over the pilot house and the length of the ship it would go. That's some pretty serious waves. Once she got past the rapids and into the lake, she knew immediately it was a mistake. It was just too bad to go on, and so they attempted to turn around. It's speculated that as the Price turned, she had to turn the second time to keep from running aground. On that final turn, the Price may have gotten caught sideways in a deep trough between the waves and rode over. Let's pick up the story there. The Sarnia City fought her way along and now sighted the distressed ship they had been summoned to assist. Upside down, only her bow was visible above the water. There was no way of identifying her at the time. I also found this picture here of the Price that was actually made into a postcard. You can read the bottom here. The Tragedy of Lake Huron. Charles S. Price Mystery Ship. It was considered a mystery ship because all the identification of the ship was below the water, so no one could tell for sure who it was, and even the owners of the ship didn't think it was theirs. They thought theirs was stranded on shore someplace up along the northern part of Lake Huron. It remained a mystery ship until Tom Reed sent his diver down to identify it. But when the sea was calm again, Lewis Myers submerged and chiseled the letters off the stern of the mysterious ship. She proved to be the Charles S. Price, a 600-foot bulk freighter. I thought you might be interested to see how it was reported in the local paper. Unknown vessel and crew of 30 drowned. One of the most awful of marine disasters right in plain sight of the mouth of St. Clair River. Within plain sight of Huron Beach and even the mouth of St. Clair River, a big unknown steel freighter turned turtle sometime during Sunday night's storm, and in all probability carried to a watery grave its crew of more than 30 brave sailors, as it purposely projected to mark the spot where so many men met sudden death. The bow of the steamer sticks out like a huge black shaft, in the shadow of which occurred one of the most disastrous accidents of the lakes. That not a soul was saved is the only natural conclusion after an inspection of the steamer and her position in the lake. It is probable that death came with awful suddenness to the crew of the ill-fated boat. The steamer was first discovered late yesterday afternoon by the Reed Wrecking Company, tug Sarnia City, which ventured out into the lake despite the fact that seas were rolling high and that it was almost impossible to make headway. I'll read a couple more excerpts, and I'll put all this on here, and you can pause and stop the video so you can read the whole article, but I won't read it all to you. Here's another excerpt. When the news of the awful disaster spread over the city last night, there were many anxious people. A large percentage of Port Huron's population has relatives on the lakes, and all were desirous of learning the name of the steamer. But the lake held its secret securely, and no amount of speculation could positively reveal the identity of the boat. All that could be done was to wait for daylight and the hope that the Sarnia City would bring in positive identification. And it ends with this statement. Vessel captains who were out in the storm say the waves climbed up over their ships, sweeping them full length in a manner never before experienced. 27 men and 1 woman lost their lives that night on the Charles S. Price. Charles S. Price wasn't the only ship that sank that night. There were many ships that sank. As you can see from this map, the little dark ship icons are the ones that sank, and the lighter gray are the ones that were run aground. It gives you some idea of the terrible toll that this storm took. The grim toll was 235 seamen drowned, 10 ships sunk, and more than 20 others driven ashore. Here on Lake Huron, all 178 crewmen on the 8 ships claimed by its waters were lost. You can see by these newspaper headlines that the final toll was much worse than anybody anticipated. Originally, they started out here in this newspaper at 30 lost on stormy Huron as gale rages here. That was revised in the headlines here, 100 perish in lakes as storm horror grows. And then we see this, death total on lakes may be 273. And on the front page they have a picture of the Charles S. Price. The bodies from the doomed freighters began washing ashore along the Canadian side of Lake Huron, between Sarnia and Goderich, on Tuesday. Men with ice in their hair were found with their heads bowed across life preservers as if praying. Some were found wrapped in each other's arms or in frozen clusters. The steward of the Price was found with his apron frozen stiff still on him. As the bodies were discovered, they were taken to lakeside towns where inquests were held, and relatives and friends could identify them. In Thetford, Ontario, the bodies were lined up under blankets on the floor of a combination furniture store and funeral parlor. Milton Smith, the fellow that had the good sense not to go on that ship and return home to his family in Port Huron, identified his first body there. "That's big good-natured John," he said of his chief engineer. "All the boys liked him." "Are you sure?" asked the coroner. "Sure, I'm sure," replied Smith. "I worked under him all season. I saw him just last Saturday. I ought to know. Why, what's the trouble?" "If he was chief engineer aboard the Price," said the coroner, "then why does he have a Regina life preserver wrapped around him?" The bodies of her captain and numerous crew members were washed ashore before long, and a further mystery developed. Men identified as sailors from the Price were wearing life jackets carrying the name of the ship, Regina, which also was lost in that same area. There was much conjecture, but authorities felt that the two ships possibly collided, and some crewmen either jumped or were thrown by the impact from one ship to another. The real facts were never learned. And it remains a mystery today, for a couple different reasons. This is the Regina here, and it actually sank further up north of the thumb, up by Point of Arcs, and whereas the Price was much closer to Port Huron. Plus, when they examined the Charles Price, they didn't see any damage where they may have collided. So we'll probably never know what happened. And of course, the beaches on both sides of Lake Huron were littered with the debris from the ships, in this case the lifeboat. There were a couple instances where lifeboats were able to go over the side, but the crew never made it to shore alive. Here we see the oars of the lifeboats from the ship Regina and also from the Wexford. There were a few ships that made it through that storm, and one of those ships was the J.H. Sheadle. The captain of that ship was S.A. Lyons, and he gives a first-hand report. We have a record of the letter that he wrote to the company that he worked for, stating what happened during that storm. It's not often we get a first-hand report of something that happened over 100 years ago and still exists today, and that report does exist. And I hesitated about reading excerpts from this because it certainly will lengthen the video. But if you're like most people that enjoy history, I think that you would have a good imagination. And you might have to use your imagination here, maybe just shut your eyes. But I have found some pictures in the Library of Congress of the ship that he was on shortly after it was built. And so you can look at some of those pictures if you like. By looking at these pictures, you'll be able to see some of the very areas that he was talking about in this report, which is kind of interesting. Either way, try to envision yourself during that storm as he gives his account of it. I'll pick up his report. He was in Lake Huron, up by the northern part of the thumb. And he says this: "We got the regular soundings at Point of Arcs that we have been getting on previous trips, and by the soundings and the time we could tell when we were abreast of the point. It was snowing a blinding blizzard, and we could not see anything. The bell rang for supper at 3:45, which was prepared and the table set, when a gigantic sea mounted our stern, flooding the fantail, sending torrents of water through the passageways on each side of the cabin, concaving the cabin, breaking the windows in the after cabin, washing our provisions out of the refrigerator and practically destroying them all, leaving us with one ham and a few potatoes. We had no tea or coffee. Our flour was turned into dough. The supper was swept off the tables and all the dishes smashed. Volumes of water came down on the engine through the upper skylights, and at times there were from 4 to 6 feet of water in the cabin. Considerable damage was done to the interior of the cabins and fixtures. The after steel bulkhead of the cabin was buckled. All the skylights and windows were broken in. The small working boat on the top of the after cabin and the mate's chadbern were washed away. It was blowing about 70 miles an hour at this time, with high seas, one wave following another very closely. Owing to the sudden force of the wind, the seas had not lengthened out as they usually do when the wind increases in the ordinary way. In about 4 hours, the wind had come up from 25 to 75 miles an hour. Immediately after the first sea swept over our stern, I ordered the boatswain to take sufficient men and shutters to close all windows in the after cabin. The men forced their way aft, braving the wind, sleet, and seas, one hand grasping the life rail and the other the shutters. Reaching the after cabin in safety, they began securing the shutters, when another tremendous sea swept over the vessel, carrying away the shutters. The men were forced to cling to whatever was nearest them to keep from being washed overboard. Immediately a third sea, equally as severe, boarded the vessel, flooding the fantail and hurricane deck. The men finally made the shelter of the dining room and galley. One of the oilers stood watch at the dining room door, closing it when the boat chipped the sea and opening it when the decks were cleared to let the water out of the cabins. The steward and his wife were standing knee-deep in the icy water. The steward's wife was assisted into the engine room. The steward remained in the dining room, securing furniture and silverware. The firemen and seamen were comfortable in their rooms as they were not touched. Some of the outfit of the private dining room was washed into the mess room. The steward's trunk was washed out of his room and stood on end in the galley. The steward's wife had to remain all night in the engine room wrapped in a blanket. Water through the engine room skylight drenched the two engineers who were throttling the engines. I do not think it ever happened before when these two men had to stand by these two positions constantly. From 2:30 p.m. until 5 o'clock, the engines raced, requiring the greatest care and judgment. At times, the ship was so heavily burdened with seas coming over her deck that her revolutions were decreased from 75 to 35 turns per minute. I called the engineer up at this time and told him that at 10 o'clock, the night of the November 9th, I was going to turn around, head to the sea, unless I could locate the land or Fort Gratiot light, and wanted to increase the speed of the ship up to that time so as to enable me to bring the boat around, headed to the account of the sea running behind us. At 10 o'clock we turned, heading north half east. The vessel rode very heavily, but came around all right, head to. I should judge that we were 10 minutes in turning. At that time we were about 10 miles north of Fort Gratiot by the soundings we got, 10 fathoms. I had everything lashed before we turned. No one thought of a life preserver. The way the ship was behaving, we had every confidence in her. The heavy rolling tore adrift the binnacle on top of the pilot house. After that it was extremely dangerous to be in the house, as this heavy object was hurled back and forth across the deck as the ship labored and rode in the heavy sea. At 4:15 a.m., November 10th, I turned again, heading south 1/4 west. This time we experienced much difficulty in turning, the ship remaining longer in the trough of the sea on account of not getting so much way and running head into it. But she behaved well, handled well in every way, and steered well. The rolling was very bad. I was lifted right off my feet. Only by the greatest effort were the second mate and myself able to hold on to the stanchions on the top house, our legs being parallel with the deck most of the time. Again and again she plunged forward, only to be baffled in her attempts to run before it, sometimes fetching up standing and trembling from stem to stern. She was buffeted about by the tremendous seas, almost helpless, dipping her hatches in the water on either side, barrels of oil and paint getting adrift and smashing out the sides of the paint locker. The men were tossed around the wheelhouse at will. I feared her steering gear had given way, but fortunately on examination they proved to be all right. She would gain half a point only to lose it, but finally, after a mighty effort, she swung around. I never have seen seas form as they did at this time. They were large, and seemed to run in series, one mounting the other like a mighty barrier. The 70-mile gale lasted from 10 o'clock Sunday morning until about 2 o'clock Monday morning. 16 hours of it, with continuous snow all the time. We kept our whistle blowing all the time, but at times we up forward could not even hear it ourselves. At 8:30 a.m. it had cleared up, so we could see quite a distance, so we turned around again, heading south 1/2 west, the wind and sea going down. In 15 minutes we could see the west shore, and sighted what I suppose was a wreck of the Price, passing his hull at about a distance of 1,000 feet. We noted what we thought were oil barrels and wreckage floating out over a 1/4 mile to the leeward of her. Just before we arrived abreast of the wreck, we cast our deep-sea lead to determine what water there was in that locality and found 10 fathoms. We proceeded on our way over to the location where the Fort Gratiot lightship should have been stationed. We had slowed down to a slow speed sometime before we got into this locality. I picked up the stack of the lightship, which had drifted 2 or 3 miles out of position. Just at this time it shut into snow again, and I backed away from the stack 3/4 of a mile or more, letting go my anchor and waiting there until it cleared up at 12 o'clock noon. When it cleared up, we proceeded to the St. Clair River. There was damage up and down the shoreline as well, whether it be homes or whether it be buildings. Any city that was close to the shoreline suffered damage. Up around Keewatin Beach, you can see the damage in these old photos that I found. You can see that the caption here says that a great storm ripped up the concrete walk on Keewatin Beach, the force of the wind standing some of the concrete flagstones on end. Note the altered shoreline. Shoreline was almost up to the house. And this one here says trees were generally uprooted along Keewatin Beach above Port Huron, and the embankment washed away and the shoreline carried back to the very foundation of the houses. These next two pictures show the canal from both views, toward the lake and away from the lake. And this one says, this photograph looking from the lake shows the canal at Port Huron filled with sand. The sand was carried into the canal over a breakwater, giving some idea of the wind velocity. And the second photo here says, the canal at Port Huron looking toward the lake. This canal formerly was 30 feet wide, but after the storm it was 80 feet wide and filled with sand instead of water, for 1,000 feet back from the shoreline. Funerals were held in almost all the Great Lakes states, both the big cities and the small cities. This city right here had lost 5 to the storm. You can see the hearses in this photograph. No one ever expected a hurricane on the Great Lakes, but that's what it was. In fact, it was referred to as the Great White Hurricane of 1913. Outside the undertakers, all the life preservers from those bodies that were recovered, was a grim reminder of all the folks that lost their life in that storm. There are many things about this video that interested me, but one of the things I found very interesting was the fact that Tom Reed would take a tugboat of this size into the storm that was putting waves over the top of the pilot houses on freighters. Those are some very big waves, and this ship isn't that big. The man had a lot of courage. Many of the folks on the lake were very thankful for Tom Reed, but Anna wasn't too impressed with that storm. She felt that she lost her husband because she just hardly ever saw him because of all the ships that needed salvaging. Here's what it said in the book about this. Thanksgiving in 1913 had been just another day in the Reed home. In Christmas, it was the Black Fall, when shipping had suffered as never before, and Tom became almost a stranger to his family. A telephone call, brief greetings, these had to suffice. Tom Reed's course was mapped, and it held little room for enjoyment of the home comforts his life of danger had purchased for his family. Today we enjoy Lake Huron for swimming and boating. We give no thought to what happened over 100 years ago. Even the freighters today with their high-tech navigational systems don't think much about that. But there was a time, after 1913, years after, that the sailors on the lakes knew exactly what was underneath them and exactly what happened in the great storm of 1913.